my teaching and understanding around sexuality, which is core to what I want to stand for in the world today. And it's hard won. I didn't understand it as clearly as I do today 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And my teaching evolves. And so it's been the work of a lifetime. In some sense, one dimension of my life has been, a kind of playing with fire, a kind of, experiment in eros, in which I took every person seriously with great honor. There's always a normal hurt, in the normal arc of human relationships, but I really worked to take care of and honor everyone in the best way I could. And there were, as you know, intervening forces in the system. And looked at our video, where there's a smoke bomb, really talks about how when there's a trauma in the system, that which would have been normal relationship, even normal hurt in the normal arc of human relationship, gets exaggerated, traumatized, and frozen. I want to brass that's a separate tragedy. But my stand on sexuality and has to do with really the larger social issues, that you're talking about. See, we're missing two basic narratives in society. And I think you can't understand the dynamics of this, last smear campaign or the larger stories around sexuality that are rife in our culture, where there are false complaints, right, all over the place, false sexual complaints made on the one hand. On the other hand, there's sexual abuse and then rape. And those two, work together. Those things are related to each other. There's shadow on both sides. There are men and women, right? We make great mistakes around sexuality. And there are more women today making false complaints than there are men. That's particularly feminine. And there are more men sexually harassing than there are women. But the aisles cross. There's women, right, sexually harassing and men making false complaints. Both of those exist, but they come from something deeper. There's a deeper social structure, which is directly the listening into which I'm trying to think and share and teach today. And I would say it as follows. One, we've lost our sexual narrative. We don't have a sexual narrative. We don't know what sex is. This most powerful human force, right? The very God impulse itself. It's a very evolutionary impulse itself, which expresses itself in the sexual. We don't know what it is. In the old world and in the great traditions, at least there were laws governing sexuality. Some of them were problematic. They were often repressive. They created their own set of problems, but at least there was a narrative. I think it was some sort of narrative. And there were, at least in some great traditions, places that sex was positive and there was a container for it. In other places that it was negative, but it was held in something with all of the attendant shadow because of the negativity around sexuality. But it didn't exist in a vacuum. Then you moved out of the kind of world in which the great traditions reigned. Religions and their sexual positions really dominated culture, but you moved into a world which was dominated by X amount of sexual myths. Monogamy remained the only form of sexuality. Premarital sex, wasn't a genuine possibility, for most people, most of the time. Sex was directly connected to reproduction because the pill, birth control, didn't exist. So we remained in a sexual world that was post-religious, but nonetheless had very clear, social, conventional sexual structures and boundaries. Then, with the sexual revolution in the 60s, everything explodes. Sex is the final frontier, right? But people cross it and find it wanting. So much sex and so little fulfillment. And so we don't know where to go. We've kind of tried everything. And so what's happened is, right, we've deconstructed all our sexual narratives, and we haven't reconstructed, rearticulated, evolved a new sexual narrative. So today, sex negative, that's an insufficient sexual narrative today. Sex positive, panacea, it's all wonderful. Sexual revolution 60s. No, that doesn't quite work either. Right? We need something more. It's not just positive. It's not just, be permissive or promiscuous as you please. That seems wrong in our bodies as well. Sex neutral, like Kinsey, the great sex researcher said, sex is just neutral. It's just like anything else. Well, sex isn't quite neutral. Having dinner, and making love or fucking are actually not the same. right? And finally, sex sacred. In sex sacred, usually as sex creates babies. Well, sex is the source of life creating babies. Well, that's also it's beautiful, but it's also an insufficient but partial sexual narrative, because most sex that most people have most of the time is not in order to create babies. So what we're doing, we're missing any sort of narrative around sexuality. And the response is either a Puritanism, kind of regressive Puritanism, in which there's a sexual shame so strongly at play in the culture, right? Sex was had, right? Sex was had, something tragic and devastating and horrific has happened, right? And there's, again, it's a hidden anti-sexual bias. It's a hidden shame around sexuality, right? Because sexuality causes us to lose control, because our social persona, right, is undermined, because dimensions, right, of who we are, right, find expression only in sexuality that we don't know what to do with. I'm a powerful businessman, yet I like to surrender. What's that about? Right? I'm this very demure housewife, but I like to be dominating. What's that about? Right? And the story goes on and on. And so we lack a sexual narrative, and we need to reclaim a sexual narrative. And core to everything I believe in and stand for is that there's a new sexual narrative that is emergent. And I want to really work with that. And in all of my, teaching in the last 5 years, it's been about that topic, right? And how we articulate this new sexual narrative, which is a bigger conversation in this video, but it's exciting. In one sentence, sex is the evolutionary eros of self. Right? Sex is the erotic impulse of cosmos. Sex is what drives, right? It's the allurement that drives all of cosmos. It drives quarks, right? To integrate, to attract, to be allured to other quarks. It drives atoms to other atoms, which then create new life. Right? Higher level atoms, molecules, and molecules create complex molecules. And complex molecules ultimately awaken and vivify and animate as cells, as cellular life. Actually, reality, right, is allurement, or reality is fuck, right? Or reality is sex, or God is eros. It's all saying the same thing, all the way up and all the way down, meaning the core structure of reality is attraction, allurement. And that's what awakens in us. That's the evolutionary eros, right? That's the ecstatic God impulse. So the drive for contact is actually not something that's shameful. It's actually the core nature of reality, and it's gorgeous, it's stunning, it's beautiful. Now, that doesn't mean that we have sex with anyone at any time without appropriate boundaries, mutuality, et cetera. That's all in place. But we actually begin to articulate a sexual narrative that's an affront to shame. It's not this strange thing that's moving in my feminine body as I hit puberty, or my masculine body as I hit puberty, and I'm not sure what to do with it, and I got to figure it out, right? And the rules around it are all completely cluttered and confusing. And I'm not sure, should I want sex or not want sex? And if I do want sex, I'm a slut. And if I don't give sex, then I'm kind of a prude. And who am I? From the feminine perspective and from the male perspective, sex is somehow delegitimated in 1,000 ways. And yet it's the great desire in other ways. It's deep in our culture. And my friend Warren Farrell likes to say, parents walk through a room, and they see their children watching, a violent movie in which people are getting blown up and shot and stabbed all over the place. They watch the violent movie, but basically they'll just keep walking, because they're watching, some bang up Western, or some bang up, Jason Statham movie, whatever it is. But if parents walk through and they see a naked man and a naked woman, right, the naked man's sexual organ is entering the woman. Oh my God, what are you watching? What are you doing? What's happening here? Let's run quick, turn off the TV. Because the transmission of that. Transmission is powerful. Right? So boys, go to get that, which they're implicitly taught is in some sense shameful. So what does that do to boys? So there's this enormous lack of sexual narrative. If we articulate, if we evolve our sexual narrative, which is evolving the very source code of culture, and we get reality is allurement. God is allurement. But reality is eros. Reality is fuck. It's all the way up, all the way down. It's beautiful. But it's sacred. It's drive towards contact, which creates new possibility, which creates new reality. And one of those new realities is a baby, right? In particular context. But actually every coming together, every drive towards contact, right, creates intimacy, creates new possibility. That's an exciting sexual narrative. That can actually take us somewhere.